The Krymchaks are Jewish ethno-religious communities of Crimea derived from Turkic-speaking adherents of Orthodox Judaism. They have historically lived in close proximity to the Turkic Karaites who follow Karaite Judaism. At first, Krymchak was a Russian descriptive used to differentiate them from their Ashkenazi Jewish coreligionists, as well as other Jewish communities in the former Russian Empire such as the Georgian Jews. But in the second half of the 19th century this name was adopted by the Krymchaks themselves. Before this, the self-designation was literally "children of Israel." The Crimean Tatars referred to them as Zulu fly Kafutla to distinguish them from the Karaites, who were called Zulus. His Kafutla language. The Krymchaks speak a modified form of the Crimean Tatar language, called the Krymchak language. It is the Jewish patois, or ethnologue of Crimean Tatar, which is a Krymchak Turkic language. Krymchak is not a distinct language, but only one constituent of Crimean Tatar. Before the Russian Revolution in 1917, the Krymchaks were at least bilingual. They spoke the Krymchak ethnologue and at the same time mostly used Hebrew for their religious life and for written communication. The Krymchaks adhered to the Turkic patois up to World War II, but later began to lose the linguistic identity. Now they are making efforts to revive the language. Many of the linguistic characteristics of the Krymchak language can be found in the Crimean Tatar language. In addition, it contains numerous Hebrew and Aramaic loanwords and was traditionally written in Hebrew characters. Origins. Krymchaks, who probably partially descended from Jewish refugees who settled along the Black Sea in ancient times. Jewish communities existed in many of the Greek colonies in the region during the late Classic period. Recently excavated inscriptions in Crimea have revealed a Jewish presence at least as early as the 1st century BCE. In some Crimean towns, monotheistic pagan cults called Sebo-Menwathi and Hypsiston existed. These quasi-proselytes kept the Jewish commandments but remained uncircumcised and retained certain pagan customs. Eventually, these sects disappeared as the members adopted either Christianity or normative Judaism. Another version is that after suppression of Bar Kokhba's revolt by the Emperor Hadrian, those Jews who were not executed were exiled to the Crimean Peninsula. The late Classical era saw great upheaval in the region as Crimea was occupied by Goths, Huns, Bulgars, Khazars, and other peoples. Jewish merchants such as the Radhanites began to develop extensive contacts in the Pontic region during this period, and probably maintained close relations with the Proto-Krymchak communities. Khazar dominance of Crimea during the early Middle Ages is considered to have at least a partial impact on Krymchak demographics. Middle Ages. In the late 7th century most of Crimea fell to the Khazars. The extent to which the Krymchaks influenced the ultimate conversion of the Khazars and the development of Khazar Judaism is unknown. During the period of Khazar rule, intermarriage between Crimean Jews and Khazars was likely, and the Krymchaks probably absorbed numerous Khazar refugees during the decline and fall of the Khazar kingdom. It is known that Kipchak converts to Judaism existed, and it is possible that from these converts the Krymchaks adopted the distinctive language. The Mongol conquerors of the Pontic-Caspian steppe were promoters of religious freedom, and the Genoese occupation of southern Crimea saw rising degrees of Jewish settlement in the region. The Jewish community was divided among those who prayed according to the Sephardi, Ashkenazi and Romaniote rites. Only in 1515 were the different traditions united into a distinctive Krymchak rite by Rabbi Moshe Hagoda, the chief rabbi of Kiev, who had settled in Crimea. In the 18th century the community was headed by David ben Karasibazar Leino Eliezer, author of the introduction to the Kafir Rite prayer book and Mishkan David, devoted to Hebrew grammar. He was also the author of a monumental monumental Hebrew historical chronicle, the Var-Sephatim, on the history of the Crimean Khanate, Tatar and Turkish rule. Under the Crimean Khanate, the Jews lived in separate quarters and paid the dhimmi tax. A limited judicial autonomy was granted according to the Ottoman millet system. Overt, violent persecution was extremely rare. According to anthropologist S. Weisenberg, the origin of Krymchaks is lost in the darkness of the ages. Only one thing can be said, that they carry less Turkic blood than the Karaites. Although certain kinship between both peoples and the Khazars can hardly be denied, but Krymchaks during the Middle Ages and modern times constantly mixed with the European counterparts. There was an admixture of Italian Jewish blood from the time of the Genoese with the arrival of the Lombroso, Piastro and other families. Cases of intermarriage with Russian Jews occurred in recent times. There is no general work on the ethnography of Krymchaks. The available summary of folklore materials is not complete. Extensive anthroponymic data has been collected from the late 19th and early 20th centuries, but does not cover earlier periods, for which archival material does exist. The study of each of these groups of sources can shed light on the ethnogenesis of the Krymchak ethnic minority. Russian and Soviet rule. The Russian Empire annexed Crimea in 1783. The Krymchaks were thereafter subjected to the same religious persecution imposed on other Jews in Russia. Unlike the Karaite neighbors, the Krymchaks suffered the full brunt of anti-Jewish restrictions. During the 19th century, many Ashkenazim from Ukraine and Lithuania began to settle in Crimea. Compared with these Ashkenazim, the Krymchaks seemed somewhat backward. Their illiteracy rates, for example, were quite high, and they held fast to many superstitions. Intermarriage with the Ashkenazim reduced the numbers of the distinct Krymchak community dramatically. By 1900 there were 60,000 Ashkenazim and only 6,000 Krymchaks in Crimea. In the mid-19th century the Krymchaks became followers of Rabbi Chaim Hezekiah Medani, a Sephardi rabbi born in Jerusalem who had come to Crimea from Istanbul. His followers accorded him the title of Gaon. Settling in Karas-u-Bazar, the largest Krymchak community in Crimea, Rabbi Medani spent his life raising their educational standards. After the Russian Revolution of 1917, civil war tore apart Crimea. Many Krymchaks were killed in the fighting between the Red Army and the White Movement. More still died in the famines of the early 1920s and the early 1930s. Many emigrated to the Holy Land, the United States and Turkey. Under Joseph Stalin, the Krymchaks were forbidden to write in Hebrew and were ordered to employ the Cyrillic alphabet to write their own language. Synagogues and yeshivas were closed by government decree. Krymchaks were compelled to work in factories and collective farms. Holocaust and after. Unlike the Crimean Karaites, the Krymchaks were targeted for annihilation by the Nazis. 6,000 Krymchaks, almost 75% of the population, were killed by the Nazis. Moreover, upon the return of Soviet authority to the region, many Krymchaks found themselves deported to Central Asia along with the Crimean Tatar neighbors. By 2000, only about 600 Krymchaks lived in the former Soviet Union, about half in Ukraine and the remainder in Georgia, Russia, and Uzbekistan. Some 600 to 700 Krymchaks still clinging to the Crimean identity live in the United States and Israel.